I'm really excited to be here today to talk about this topic. As Sarah mentioned, I currently work at Google in our open source programs office, as well as with the CHAOSS community. And I wanted to share a little bit of background about myself. But first off, I wanted to share a fun fact that this is actually my second SciPy that I've participated in virtually. So hopefully third time's a charm and I'll be able to show up in person next year. But I'm incredibly thankful to the session organizers and staffing for allowing me to do this presentation virtually. So as Sarah indicated, I have started my career as a market researcher through my bio. I didn't know that was going to be read, so I prepared an About Me slide as well, where I ran, designed, and built surveys, analyzed results from surveys, and presented that back to our clients at our company. And so I served as a market researcher and consultant for a number of years, and then transitioned over to Google, where I supported a product strategy role, still performing a lot of market level analysis in support of product roadmap and decision making. And then a few years ago, I joined the open source programs office with the title of program manager, but as the bio indicated, I manage research and analytical programs in support of our open source projects and communities across Google. And throughout all of these roles, as well as my work within the CHAOSS community, it's really centered around collecting data, interpreting data, and using that to make decisions about what we should do in our communities, in our projects, in our spaces. So that's the topic that I want to bring us to today, because I think measurement can be an incredibly valuable tool to help us guide our investments and our priorities. What are things we want to change? We need to start with who's in our community, how do we want to change that, and how do we know if the programs that we've put in place are actively working toward those goals? And understanding who's present in our spaces and how that's changing over time is really going to help us give us feedback to make those decisions. But as the title indicated, there's an inherent challenge with this, which is collecting data about our communities, especially data about underrepresented groups. These groups are by definition underrepresented. So if you're familiar with running and executing surveys and survey best practices, you might end up with the low data problem or not enough sample to really understand how to understand this, or either how to share this in a way that doesn't expose those individuals because they're the only person that might have identified in a particular group. So I want to share with you a number of best practices and tactics that you can take back to your communities and measurement efforts in order to make sure that we're not inadvertently exposing or re-identifying anyone who takes part in these efforts. So I want to start the conversation first with the we and the who. I said we want to do this, but who is we, and where you're running this from and what perspective or context you're coming from is going to change or color what things you are subject to. Say, I work at a large company that has very explicit policies and measures that we apply to data handling practices due to our company policies, as well as regulatory and compliance measures. And so I'm subject to those things when I run community surveys on behalf of my company. But when you do this on behalf of a project, you might be subject to different things, either policies dictated by the project or the foundation level. And acknowledge that in all of this, there is a lot of personally identifiable information, even if you're just collecting Git commit logs. But if you're expanding that to also collect a wide range of demographic information, which you might do for something like understanding representation, this is going to be an incredibly sensitive data set. And so we want to ensure that we're taking the proper precautions in line with things that we're subject to, as well as best practices for data handling. One thing that I'm going to be sharing a couple of resources throughout this. One I'd like to point to here is within the CHAOSS community, when we were starting to scale up the diversity, equity, and inclusion event badging program, we realized that we were collecting a lot of sensitive information about people and attendees and presenters at these events. And so we thought it was prudent to create our own data handling policy. We, as the CHAOSS organization, this is how we approach ensuring the protection and privacy of all those that share their information with us on behalf of these programs. And we wanted to share that policy publicly and transparently with all that engage with us and share their data with us. So when we think about the tools available to us to better understand our communities, the most popular tool is always running a survey. It's easy to anonymize, and it's a great way to reach a lot of people. But it might not be the only thing available to us, and depending on the size of your community, maybe a survey isn't always the best fit. So you can have interviews, there can be discussion forums, and ways that we can explicitly ask and engage with individuals across our community. There are also indirect ways to understand, say, our overall community size through things like scraping available data on the web or across popular platforms or channels that our community participates in. And then there's always the third option, which is filling in the holes with what we know or what we can infer based on models, tools, or personal guesses. And in regards to, say, research efforts where estimation is part of the practice to understand and evaluate whatever question you're investigating, say something like representation in a community, for specifically measuring your own community, this is never going to be something that I'm going to recommend because it encourages behavior that is potentially problematic and encouraging something like stereotyping. So we never want to guess when it comes to actually representing specific identifiers and demographics within our communities. The next stage is, now that we know we want to pursue this, we have to do so in a way that we secure consent up front from anyone participating and sharing their data with us. So another reason why I like surveys is because it presents an explicit tool to go out and ask for permission. You have an event, you have a survey that you're launching, and upfront in the text will say, this is what I intend to do, this is what I intend to collect, this is what we intend to do with the data and how we intend to share it back. And then given all that information, the individual can continue to take your survey or opt out. And so we're explicitly asking for the permission to use their information in this way. But even within that, there could be additional exceptions where we allow for more conditional consent. Say, if you don't achieve enough responses in a specific category, then we won't share this data, or allowing respondents to opt out of specific demographic questions. The one thing I want to caveat up front with an anonymous survey is the inherent challenge of being able to withdraw a submission after the fact. Because if you're running a completely anonymous survey, there is no identifier associated with any individual response. So if someone wants to go in and remove what they shared with you, that's impossible, unfortunately. And there are kind of ways to get around this, but depending on how strict your definition is of identifiable information, say a unique ID, that could be considered not anonymous anymore. And so if you want to do completely anonymous, you won't be able to do this. And that's something you want to state upfront in that sort of informed and consent statement. When we're scraping data from existing platforms, we get to borrow the explicit consent given to that platform, so more implicit or transitive consent, in that a user signs up for a platform with their user information, and they choose what to give to that platform. And if you collect data from that platform and comply with all of the policies laid forth by that platform, then you're essentially able to write on the consent that the user granted to that platform because you're complying with their extended policies. Note that there's also conditional or partial information here. Maybe if you're pulling data from a GitHub organization, some of that information is only going to be available to members of that organization. Also, there are some fields that are not optional or required. So there's some messiness and inherent gaps in this data set. And the thing to note here is, while if you do comply with all the platform policies, it doesn't actually apply to the case of aggregating across platforms. There is no way to explicitly give consent to combine data or aliases across various different platform data collection processes. So if this is something you plan to do and then share back with your community, I would highly suggest that you do so in a transparent fashion, similar to what you would have done with the survey, where you ask for permission, you ask for awareness of this practice, and provide a mechanism for people to either opt out or express their concerns. And again, I'm never going to recommend guessing here because there's no explicit way to grant consent, and it's subject to inaccuracy and, again, encourages stereotyping. So to talk a little bit more about surveys, if you've ever run a survey or taken any sort of market research or survey training class, the first thing that we're going to talk about is sample size, because this is how we know what portion of the community is represented in our sample. With an explicit market research guidance, you can look up what is a significant sample size based on the size of my overall community. And based on that relationship and confidence level, it'll allow you to say, either this is some representing a portion of the population, or can we extrapolate this to our entire population because we have significant enough sample. The inherent challenge of this with open source is that most of us don't know what our exact community size is. It might look a little bit different on any given day on any individual platform that you're looking at, which is why I like looking at that, the scraping mechanism as a way to understand our total possible population size, because this is going to inform how we set our goals around how much sample we'd like to collect and when we know when to stop surveying. Note that there's always going to be inherent bias in any survey that we run. We are people, we are subject to our own biases, and we're also subject to the inherent systematic biases of, say, what platforms are we recruiting from? acknowledging that not all of your participants in your community are going to be active on every platform. If you restrict recruiting to only one platform, you're going to be missing whole portions of your population. So the suggestion is to try to reduce this as much as possible by recruiting on a diversity of channels across your community to try to reach all of your population as much as possible, while respecting the norms. There are some communities that have specific channels dedicated to specific things, say an issue triage management, where you only want to have issues raised or discussed in that channel. That's probably not an appropriate place to field a survey or recruit for a survey, where a general informational channel or an announcement channel is a much better fit. So ensure that you're respecting the norms established on that particular channel so you're not overstepping people's expectations. Regarding sample sizes, again, there are most certainly lower limits that market researchers start to get very uncomfortable with. And this is typically sharing subsets or samples that are 50 or less. So 50 is usually the lower limit that most market researchers will suggest, knowing that in open source, the community sizes are all over the map. This might not be possible, in which case I would say you can go as low as 30, but recognize that you're now started towing the line with how small a sample is going to be acceptable by research professionals. And acknowledging that the smaller and smaller that your sample is, the easier it is to pick out specific people possibly from your sample, especially say if they are the only person that identifies in one particular group. So note that if you do have a very small sample and you can't do anything about it, not to say that you have to throw out the data and start again, but you're going to change the way that you present it. If you are going to share data below 30, which I wouldn't really recommend, but if you're going to do it anyway, show it as a count, don't show it as a percentage. For some reason, it's harder to contextualize percentages, but if I see the number 7 people said X, I'm going to change the way that I interpret that versus say if that represents 30% of the people that we actually engage with. And then for very small samples, you might just want to only quote or describe your findings versus showing data explicitly. Because again, we don't want to inadvertently expose someone who thought they were taking an anonymous survey because they happen to be the only person that identified in a particular way. Concerning the questions themselves, one thing that we like to do as researchers is it's really easy to try to sneak in just a few more questions, because wouldn't it be great to know and then suddenly we have an incredibly long survey that no one is going to get through. So the general best practice is do not exceed 25 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes is better. But especially when we're thinking about surveys that are collecting a lot of demographic information and sensitive information, if we are asking more than we need, we're increasing the risk of that data set and risk profile of the data set without necessity. So if you don't plan to use this information, if this is something you're not going to track overall, then don't ask it. Only ask the things that you are planning to measure on a recurring basis or planning to do something about or create a program around it. One example here, I was running a survey and we wanted to ask a question on ethnicity and racial identity. And it turns out that we didn't actually have anything in mind with that question. We were just curious. And the thing that we really wanted to know was what languages were represented in our community to know how we should be prioritizing translation in our documentation set. So we opted to drop that question in place of this language question because that was less sensitive and got exactly to the thing that we were trying to answer upfront and immediately. And not to say that we're never going to ask that second question, but we weren't prepared to justify why we needed it in that moment, and so we removed it. And this helps with just, again, increasing the comfort level of those participating in your survey because you're not asking unnecessary information. Open-ended questions are a great way to get more contextual feedback, context, and scenarios, but if you've ever reviewed a long list of open-ended questions, it can be very cumbersome for the person reading through all of them. I had one nightmare scenario where I spent over 12 hours reading open-ended question responses from a very generous respondent set, and I would like to never repeat that again. Not to say that's going to happen to you, but it's generally a best practice to limit it because it is going to, again, add time and reduce response rates by having all these open-ended questions. But then on the identification piece, it's really easy to sneak in identifiable details about a specific issue, a specific scenario, a specific event that could suddenly make this respondent identifiable because of what they've shared with you in this particular context. So it might be a good thing to remind your respondents to generalize, to limit identifiable details. And then you as the data owner and responsible for this before you share it, you still have to read it and make sure that you are redacting anything that potentially might come back to that person. Another way to reduce specificity without reducing analytic potential is using brackets and buckets for any sort of numerical category like income or age, where you're reducing the specificity, but you're also still able to have the distribution of your population in these categories. This is also a method that you can use for other types of questions, especially say in smaller populations where you might only have a handful of folks that identify in various underrepresented groups. And so maybe you want to bucket that with any underrepresented racial group or any underrepresented group in general, which again will sort of obscure the nuance of how those individuals might feel about other things or other questions. But again, if your first goal is to protect the identity of any of those individuals, this is one way you can do that by grouping them together either up front as a question or on the back end when you're going through the data if you didn't get enough of those particular categories. We mentioned this before, but please always provide an opt-out. Prefer not to answer on all possible demographic questions. There might be exceptions here when, say, maybe you want to limit your respondent group to only those that are above 18, but then you can do that in a yes or no question, and then follow up with a bracket-based question where you can have prefer not to answer. This is a great way to ensure that no one is sharing beyond their comfort levels or doesn't feel forced to share information that they're not comfortable sharing. The last point on questions here is that it can be really hard to write a quality, comprehensive list from scratch. I have done so many times, and because I've been running surveys for more than a decade, I have just a repository of questions that I like to go back to, and I continue to update per the case in front of me. But this can be really hard to write on your own, and often subject to your own bias. One of my own examples here is I was running a study alongside an event, and I forgot to include student in the employment category and found that 25% of the sample was writing it in the other comment, and I had to go back and recode that. And that was so silly. I've been a professional for 15 years, and I didn't think of it in the moment. And that's something that we don't want to repeat, and we can avoid by taking advantage of existing questions that once you look at a list, then you'll know how to adapt it for your case. It'll also help you think of things you might be missing or things that you wouldn't necessarily come up with on your own. Some examples here for demographic-minded questions or DEI-related studies. I've linked the Open Demographics Project, which is a crowdsourced list of demographic questions categories. And I listed an example community survey run by the Open Infrastructure Foundation, which is focused particularly on this topic. So you want an example of how some folks have approached this type of questionnaire in practice. This is a great place to start. A few notes about passive data collection in terms of scraping from existing platforms and data. Again, this can be a great way to start to estimate your population size as well as start with a basic set of information to explore beyond. But note that there's a lot of inherent messiness in this data. We're not even talking about automation here, but there tends to be a lot of older, outdated information. People set it up when they create their profile and then they walk away and they never come back to it. There's also a lot of missing context, especially about identifiers. Say there's a popular mechanism to use email domains to infer what company you work for. But what we're missing is whether or not you submitted that commit on behalf of your company or in your personal time, because that might just be your primary account. And that's not really something that you can get from just looking at the commit logs alone. We've already brought these things up here, but I wanted to bring them up again just to reiterate, acknowledging that not every platform and information set is generally available. So if you are going to take information from it, only share it back to the group that has subscribed to it or has access to it already, and be considerate when you're aggregating across platforms or aggregating data or aliases across platforms. I want to take a few minutes to note another case where, again, coming out of the CHAOSS community, we've been working on a number of programs related to DEI and metrics related to DEI. And one that I want to bring up here is we just launched the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Project Badging Program, which encourages projects to create markdown files speaking to each of these 4 concepts as a way to discuss how their project is working to a more welcoming, inclusive, and accessible project. And what I really like about these particular metrics is that they don't require measurement, because what we didn't really address is in really small communities, there might just not be enough to warrant a full survey. Maybe you'll do a listening session or a blind feedback session or interviews, but you just don't have enough people in your community to run a survey. And that doesn't mean you can't do anything in this realm. I like the examples here a lot because they allow project leaders to explain how they intend to make their project more accessible or what they are working on to increase accessibility of their project and assets. How they're transparent are they with their communications or with their documents or their governance documentation? What are they doing to make newcomer experience feel more welcoming, more inclusive to more communities, more time zones? And what are we doing to ensure that our leadership is also diverse and inclusive? And these are things that projects can tailor to their own case, their own initiatives, and share transparently with their community over time. Because maybe there's only 2 people in this project or less, but they want to be able to showcase to potential new contributors what they're doing to ensure that everyone feels welcome and included in this environment. So we've talked through a number of things, and I want to sort of reiterate this last part, which is that not every community is the right size and shape for a survey. And in that case, we might want to think about some of these other approaches to ensure that we are listening to our community, that we are setting goals for our community, and have a way to see how people are reacting to those that doesn't involve measuring because we just don't have enough population to measure. Something to note that I haven't really listed out explicitly, but I want to say it here, is that as a general good research practice, yes, surveys are a great place to start, but there's a little bit of pre-work that could come from listening sessions, that could come from interviews, that could come from general discussions, because that's how you're going to find the things that you want to test, to see if other people feel that way, to see if that is a common sentiment in your community. And those are hard to come up with on your own. So if you don't have a sense of what those are immediately, you might want to do a little bit of pre-work to understand what's relevant and what should be discussed in this particular study. If you do run a survey, acknowledge the fact that you're never going to get 100% participation. And if you have, I'd love to hear about it because I've never actually seen that in a study. Most of the surveys that I've run, I see around a 10 to 15% participation rate for those that are actively interested and engaged with this space. And those are the ones that actually get through any sort of filtering process. But that generally means that there's folks that are going to be missing. So looking through who responded to give you a sense of who you know is missing and how does that change how you interpret what you can infer from the results that you had. And remembering that no data is data, in that if no one responds in a particular category, it doesn't mean that they're not there. Maybe it's an indication that they felt that they didn't want to participate in the study because they felt singled out, or they didn't feel protected by the approach, or maybe they didn't have time for this. And so there can be many reasons why folks don't respond other than they don't exist in your community. And part of that is also acknowledging how externalities might be impacting your results, whether or not there were some events, any current events in your community and the broader community outside of open source that might be impacting how people feel. A lot of these surveys tend to focus or dive in on sentiment and feeling questions, which are going to be heavily covered by that individual's experience and current experience. If they're not having a very good day or a good week, they might just be more negative in this space. And you have to acknowledge that, and that's just the nature of how surveys work. I highly suggest iterative improvements. Yes, as a researcher, it's nice to have data that is consistent cycle over cycle so we can trend it exactly, because if you change the methodology, you can't trend that question anymore. But I don't think I've ever run a study again that I haven't updated, because there's always going to be new things to test. And say in your write-ins in the last iteration, there was a number of things that came up that you hadn't considered that could be possible sentiments experienced by others. In this case, maybe you want to turn some of those into their own question to see if we can have quantitative observations on these particular things. And please do not over-survey. I see so many surveys coming through my inbox, and I pick and choose the ones that I want to participate in. And so I recommend trying to coordinate with either other surveys that might be run, or make sure that you're not picking a really busy time in the community, like right before a release, to run something like this, to make sure that we're not overtaxing the same population. Something that I want to be sensitive to is that often, as a member of an underrepresented group, you get flagged for these types of interviews because you are notably different than the others in the space. But if that happens in every space, then these are the same people that are getting asked the same questions by different folks. And so we want to be sensitive to that and not make sure that we're not over asking the same people to share their experiences over and over again, which is also why I like this iterative improvement, because if you have these experiences and you can iterate how these people feel in the form of a quantitative question, then you're not asking them that directly. You're just asking others to share whether or not they feel the same thing. I've listed a couple of other resources here. An article recently published on research best practices, which talks about some of the data collection and ethical considerations in collecting data about your communities. And another report on a survey of existing literature on women's participation in open source. This is just one identity category, but this report does a wonderful survey of existing literature in this space. So it kind of summarizes existing findings, agreements, and conflicts. And a challenge to the researchers in the room, I would love to see this for other identity categories beyond just women. Coming back to some general principles to leave you on best practices, we've mentioned this throughout, but where all possible, make your surveys anonymous and do everything you can to preserve anonymity. That means that it'll encourage folks to share more honestly because they don't have fear that these answers are going to come back to them and could cause any kind of harm or retaliation. But we know, as we described earlier, that even if we do all of these things, we still might be able to figure out who people are by how they responded, how they answered specific questions. So to reduce the risk regarding that, the suggestion is to limit access to the raw data to just an individual or a handful of analysts that are actually performing the analysis on the direct data. Other ways to reduce this risk is to bring in a third party to provide that analysis. But while this costs money, and it can also miss some of the contextual nuance. So I don't really recommend this. This is something that is available to you, but at the end of the day, you're going to be much closer to your own community and have more context to interpret how people feel, how they reacted, what they responded to, and be able to share that back to the community. Another way to reduce risk here is just to limit the retention period of the raw data. How long do you need to perform the analysis? You should always save the aggregate data, but do you really need to save the raw data? This is somewhat uncomfortable, I would say personally as a researcher. I love to be able to go back and figure out if I can answer more questions based on the data set that we have. But in a data set like this, that's highly sensitive and personal, the longer it stays around, the more likely that something happens. And so the most risk-averse approach you can take is once you've completed the analysis and published your results, you remove that data set and wipe it out. And just to reiterate again, please respect the existing policies, expectations, and norms established by your project and your community. These can be found in community policies, foundation level policies, platform policies, company policies, regional regulations. Where at all possible, have someone review your work, have an audit process, review process, test your survey instrument, see how long it takes, have others test it, see how long it takes them, see if they notice anything. You can have members of the community do this for you. If you have access to something like an international institutional review board, if this is going into more research, then this is something that is a part of the process. If not, try to replicate this and any resources available to you. If you have access to legal and privacy experts, I'm very thankful to the folks that I can rely on for things like this because it helps to ensure that I've taken all the proper precautions in how I'm collecting and handling this data. And as always, clearly communicate what you're trying to do, your intentions and processes. How do you intend to use this information? What are you trying to do with it? And what are the processes you're putting in place to ensure that you're protecting the identity of all those who participate in your study? I want to close with the comment that data is just a tool, and tools are not inherently good or evil, and they depend on how you use them. So ensure that you're using data wisely. Be deliberate with what you're trying to do and what you were trying to change or encourage. Data can be an incredibly powerful tool. I had a personal experience where I was in a room, a broader team, we all took a survey together, and then we reviewed the results in real time. And to see in data quantifiably that other people had the same shared experience can be incredibly validating and say that, no, you're not the only one. Other people feel this way. And that gives more strength and more awareness to that issue that can hopefully encourage change in behavior or change in process that can address that need. And it's really easy to cherry pick data and use it out of context. So don't leave room for that. Don't leave room for misinterpretation. Always include your bases, which includes how many people you are in this question or represented by this question and what their general category was, community members of X population, for example, and the source being what was the particular effort that collected this data, and have some link or documentation on the methodology, how you collected your sample, how you recruited your sample, and how that might have impacted who ended up responding to your study. I want to thank you all for your time today, and I hope you have learned something from this. If not, I'd love to hear from you, comments, feedback, questions. I think we have a couple of minutes. If there are any questions in the room, I'd be happy to take them now.
Sweet. Testing. Hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Get this one.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the great talk, Sophia. I was wondering, so you mentioned a lot about sample size and about how we, when we do these surveys, we sometimes have a lack of data or because the data can be identifying. I was wondering, why don't we turn it around and start writing surveys for the majority to start looking at metrics such as implicit bias, such as inclusive behaviors or exclusive behaviors? Is that something that, yeah, your team has worked on?
Yes, in a way, in that I try to make surveys cover all the cases, and so you're always going to have a population in the majority, and you're always going to have a population in the minority. It's just generally how the data ends up being distributed. I think that the inherent challenge comes from the analysis stage, where as a researcher, I often want to compare how experiences might differ between the majority and the minority, in which case having them all in the same study allows you to make those comparisons and draw those comparisons because everyone saw the same question, so you can see how results might have differed. But I completely agree. I think if you are thinking about the majority of your population and trying to ensure that questions can be answered by everyone without selecting people out, I think that is a place to start, and I would be interested to see how that was run. I haven't seen someone do that explicitly, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened.
Sweet. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, cool. I'm going to kind of combine a couple here from Slack, from Benoit and Alan, but they're kind of around sample self-selection. So Benoit asked about how do you kind of accommodate for, you know, the kind of people who respond to survey questions all the time, like so that you're actually getting not just self-selecting on that. And Alan asked about like how do you adjust your samples for trolls or bad actors?
Oh, these are fun. The self-selection piece is very real. I think something here is just to try to increase awareness of your study and try to ensure that others are participating. Something I didn't mention here is incentives, which can be a way to encourage people to participate. Sometimes just saying we're going to share the results back and inform how we encourage this behavior or change our documentation or code of conduct or whatever it is that actually ends up being changed as a result of this is sometimes not enough to get other people to participate. And so sometimes you might want to offer some kind of incentive if you have something available to you that can be of interest to more people. But actually this kind of impacts the other part in terms of getting more trolls or people in there that are only there for the free t-shirt. I've seen an incredible actions taken for a free t-shirt before, so I didn't want to recommend it here just because it can cause more chaos or noise in your sample. I think that the self-selection problem is always going to be real, and I think part of it might take a more personal approach to ensure that folks really know why and the importance of why they need to respond and why we need a diversity of responses. I think it's also trying to make the survey as lightweight as possible. So this kind of comes back to the timing piece. If people are less interested in filling things out, if they have to click through multiple pages, there's more likely that they're going to drop out. So if they see all the questions up front, they're more likely to fill them out because they see an end in sight. Try to reduce the time limit as much as possible. And reducing the amount of open-ended questions can also help to reduce the time. So I kind of think about those elements as well. The longer things draw out, the more likely that people are going to drop out. And unless they really want to share something with you, they're going to stop because they're not interested. Another way to make it sort of, depending on the length of your survey and how you're doing this, sometimes if you, again, can share an incentive or something that we can share after they completed a study to make them more encouraged to do this. That can be a way, sometimes having like a raffle, but again, that's like, we can't do it through the anonymous collection part. You have to do that as an after the fact saying I did this. But there are ways to encourage that, but it is always going to be a challenge. And I think it's an inherent challenge with surveys in general. For the bad actors and trolls, I actually didn't bring this up in this session, but there is a number of tactical measures you can take to increase or decrease the amount of bogus data that you're going to get. Not to say that you're going to be able to remove all the angry people, but we can do things to reduce automation and bots. That's something that we noticed in 2020 with paid sample, is we started seeing a higher occurrence of fake responses. So clearly some sort of automated in scripts. Ways that you'll notice that showing up is if in your open-ended questions, people are writing stuff that makes no sense to you, like how now brown cow, which is a real example of something that we've seen in the survey, which is clearly not a person. This is someone who is just trying to fill out the study so they can get money because it's a paid sample. So there are ways that you can do that by, say, reading it and doing a quality check, seeing how fast it's taking people. If they're speeding through, then probably they're not really reading the questions. So if you have a general sense of how long the survey should take and how long your general distribution is taking, if you have a speeder, that's usually an indicator. If you have any sort of matrix question, which is maybe like a scale of 1 to 5 with 5 options that people are selecting, I feel strongly, or I've never felt that way, or something like that kind of scale, and somebody responds, say like C for everything, and sends we call it straight lining in the survey practice. Those could also be indicators that you're not really reading anything, and maybe they did feel maybe or like mediocre about everything, which is possible as well. But if they do that for multiple questions in a row, that's also an indicator that they're not really reading your study. So those are some of the minor things that you can do. And again, just thinking about survey length as well as question length. One of the recommendations from best practices is to try to not make your option list greater than 13, which is not very long. But the longer the list, the more likely that people are not really going to read it all and are just going to select the first thing that they see and move on. And so this can be impossible to do for things like what language do you use, which I average like 20 something list because there's so many languages, and I want to make sure that I am reaching all of the edges of interest in that population. But for everything that you can, try to just reduce the length of the question to ensure that people aren't sort of tapping out mentally as they're reading through it.
Great talk. Thank you so much for doing it. One of the things, and this is sort of related to small sample size, when you look at open source, the leadership of open source, the maintainers in open source, are oftentimes more homogeneous than the greater population of open source. How do you measure that, or any tips or ideas for measuring that without outing the very small number of underrepresented people that are maintainers and are leaders in those communities?
I guess the question of outing is more also on like how publicly facing are they? I know like for some communities you have your maintainers, or not maintainers, but like your board could be listed publicly on your website, and that's something that is more just generally available. Others, that's not the case. And maintainers, that's not necessarily the case. I think that's always going to be a challenge. I think I generally like the idea of trying to bucket. I mean, it's kind of like could be obvious how these identities are playing out, but to say that there are a handful of folks that are not part of the main identity, or their identity is different from, it doesn't necessarily force them to choose an identity that is them. And so another question, I had the sort of grouping of underrepresented groups, but another one is to explicitly ask, do you identify with the group that is not in the majority of this particular population? And just to say that you are in the other category without having to explicitly say which category you're in. I've seen others that have suggested doing more sort of like in really small populations, listening sessions, but I struggle with those because it kind of forces the same people to speak up, and I find that to be very intense and potentially uncomfortable for individuals. And so starting with something that could be anonymous as a way to sort of socialize how people are feeling. But at a certain point, it's impossible to kind of hide that. And I think it's still valid to raise those concerns and try to address them up to the level of comfort of those individuals without personally asking them to step forward, because I think that that's always going to be a scenario that everyone finds uncomfortable. Sorry, not a perfect answer, but I think it's just generally a hard problem, because I think we all want to improve representation in our spaces. And I think I like coming back to the sort of metrics we discussed in the chaos working group around how we can, as a project, declare the measures that we are taking to ensure that we have a diverse and welcoming and inclusive and accessible population, even though our population might not be very diverse today, but these are the measures that we want to take in order to encourage that and to encourage more people to feel comfortable without actually having to put the pressure on the 2 people that are not like everybody else to come forward and describe how their experience is different.
All right, we've got time for one more question, which I'm asking from Slack from Andrew. How are concepts such as fair and care for data governance applied in your work? So that's from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance.
Sorry, fair and care for data handling was the question?
Data governance. So it looks like they're principles from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance.
Oh, I'd be interested to learn those. Please share them. I think for me, it's definitely around how we comply with all the existing policies and expectations in front of us, and then going beyond that to align to the expectations and norms, as well as having someone to review this, because I think it's really easy to get it wrong and not to do so with any intention of it. It's just because you didn't notice, or we are subject to our own biases. I have only lived in the United States my entire life, and I know that bias is imparted on the work and the way that I approach things. So ensuring that there is reviews, there are some people that you're doing this not in a vacuum, you're doing this with a group, and you're sharing it and you're socializing it before you even run it, to ensure that, yes, all the questions are asked in a way that is considerate of the population, and the mechanisms around data handling, data protection, anonymization, and even encryption and deletion of the data are all in line with those expectations and in line with those policies. If there are specific pointers that you're referring to, I apologize, I'm not familiar with them, but I'm very interested to learn them and to know how we can apply them to a process like this.
Sweet. Yeah, there's some links in Slack that maybe you can check out later. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much, Sophia. This is a great talk, and yeah.
Enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you at the next talks.